The fluorescent lights of Jefferson High School cast harsh shadows across the crowded hallway as Kira Delacroix pressed herself against the row of dented lockers, hoping to blend into the peeling paint that had seen better days decades ago. The metallic tang of old metal mixed with the overwhelming scent of industrial cleaning products and teenage desperation that seemed to permeate every inch of the building. Her oversized thrift store sweater, a faded burgundy wool blend that had probably been beautiful once upon a time, hung loose on her small frame like armor that didn't quite fit. The sleeves were rolled up multiple times, revealing delicate wrists that seemed almost fragile in the harsh artificial light. Her worn sneakers, once white but now a dingy grey, with holes beginning to form near the toes, squeaked against the linoleum with each nervous shift of her weight. The sound seemed to echo in her ears, marking her presence in a way that made her stomach clench with anxiety. She clutched her books tighter to her chest, feeling the sharp corners dig into her ribs through the thin fabric of her sweater. The textbooks were borrowed from the school's lending program, their covers worn smooth by countless hands, pages yellowed with age and marked with the desperate scribbling of students who had come before her. The morning rush of students flowed around her like a river around a stone, their voices creating a wall of sound that made her feel even more invisible than usual. Conversations about weekend parties she wasn't invited to, homework assignments she struggled to keep up with, and social dramas that seemed impossibly complex swirled past her ears. She caught fragments, complaints about parents, excitement about upcoming games, gossip about who was dating whom, but none of it included her. She was a ghost, haunting the hallways of a school where everyone else seemed to have found their place. Kira had been at Jefferson for 3 months now, ever since her family moved from Louisiana after her father lost his job at the oil refinery, where he had worked for nearly 20 years. The plant closure had been sudden, a corporate decision made in boardrooms far from their small bayou community, leaving dozens of families scrambling to rebuild their lives. Her father, Jean-Baptiste Delacroix, had aged years in the span of weeks following the announcement. The proud man who had taught her to fish in the cypress swamps and told her stories of their Creole ancestors suddenly seemed smaller, diminished by circumstances beyond his control. The transition from small-town bayou life to suburban Atlanta had been jarring enough without having to navigate the social hierarchy of a school where everyone seemed to have known each other since kindergarten. In Louisiana, she had been part of a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's grandparents, where family histories stretched back generations and were as much a part of the landscape as the Spanish moss that draped the ancient oaks. Here, she was nobody, a stranger with an accent that marked her as different, as other, as someone who didn't belong. Her soft Creole accent, which had been barely noticeable back home where everyone spoke with similar inflections, now stood out like a beacon in conversations. The way she pronounced certain words, the rhythm of her speech that had been shaped by generations of French, Spanish, and African influences, drew stares and sometimes barely concealed smirks from her classmates. Her second-hand clothes, which had been perfectly acceptable in a community where thrift and practicality were valued over fashion, now marked her as poor, as someone who couldn't afford to fit in. And in a place like Jefferson, different meant target. She had learned this lesson within her first week, when casual questions about where she was from had turned into mockery of her accent, when her homemade lunches packed by her mother became subjects of ridicule, when her lack of the latest fashion trends made her an easy mark for the casual cruelty that seemed to be the social currency of teenage life. She kept her head down as she walked toward her first period biology class, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. The hair was one of her few vanities, a cascade of deep brown waves that caught hints of gold in the sunlight and fell nearly to her waist when she let it down. Usually, she kept it braided or pulled back in a simple ponytail, anything to avoid drawing attention to herself. But even restrained, it seemed to have a life of its own, with small tendrils escaping to frame her face in a way that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. What none of her classmates knew, what she kept buried beneath her quiet exterior and careful invisibility, was that beneath her humble appearance lay 15 years of training in Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, disciplines her grandfather had taught her from the time she could walk steadily enough to hold a basic stance. Papa Joseph, as she had called him since childhood, had been a man of contradictions, gentle enough to braid flowers into her hair when she was small, but fierce enough to have survived tours in Vietnam that he rarely spoke about except in fragments that came out during nightmares. The training had begun as play when she was barely 3 years old, simple games of balance and coordination that felt like dancing. Papa would hold her hands as she learned to fall safely, to roll and recover, to move her small body with purpose and control. As she grew older, the lessons became more structured, more serious. He taught her about leverage, about using an opponent's strength against them, about the importance of remaining calm under pressure. "The body remembers what the mind forgets, Cher," he would say in his gravelly voice, weathered by years of cigarettes he had finally quit when she was born. "But the mind must always control the body. Violence without thought is just destruction. Violence with purpose, with control, that's protection." The lessons had continued even after they moved to Atlanta, conducted in the small apartment they now called home. Papa had downsized his possessions to fit into their new life, but he had insisted on bringing the heavy bag that now hung from a reinforced beam in what was supposed to be the dining room. Their neighbors probably thought they were crazy, hearing the rhythmic thudding at odd hours, but Papa insisted that consistency was more important than convenience. But Papa's lessons came with strict rules about when and why to use her skills. Rules that had been drilled into her with the same intensity as the physical techniques. Self-defense was only justified when facing genuine physical threat, when all other options had been exhausted, when there was no other way to protect herself or someone who couldn't protect themselves. Dealing with teenage cruelty, with words meant to wound and social exclusion designed to isolate, didn't qualify as self-defense in his book. "Words can hurt, Cher, but they heal," he had told her more than once. "Broken bones, broken spirits from violence, those take much longer to mend. You must be sure, absolutely sure, that there is no other way before you raise your hand in anger." The first warning sign came as a shadow fell across her path, interrupting her morning ritual of trying to become one with the hallway walls. She looked up to see Trevor Holloway step directly in front of her, his considerable bulk blocking her route to biology class. The star linebacker had the kind of confident smirk that came from never being told no, from growing up as the golden boy of a family that had lived in the same affluent suburb for 3 generations. His Letterman jacket, pristine and obviously expensive, stretched tight across his broad shoulders, the leather sleeves showing not a single scuff or sign of wear. His pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who enjoyed having power over others, who had learned early in life that size and social status could be weapons as effective as any physical force. At 6'3" and probably close to 220 pounds, Trevor was used to intimidating people simply by existing in their space. His sandy brown hair was cut in the latest style, perfectly styled with what was probably more hair product than Kira's family spent on groceries in a week. "Well, well, look what we have here," Trevor drawled, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. His accent was pure Georgia suburbs, all smooth confidence and implied superiority. Swamp girls trying to sneak through without saying hello. The The nickname had stuck from her first day, when she had made the mistake of mentioning that she was from Louisiana in response to a teacher's question. It hadn't taken long for Louisiana to become swamp, and for swamp to become a verbal weapon used to remind her of her otherness, her lack of belonging in their carefully ordered suburban world. Behind him, his constant companions materialized like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Madison Pierce, the head cheerleader whose perfectly styled blonde hair seemed to defy both gravity and logic, crossed her arms and surveyed Kira with the disdain of someone examining an insect that had dared to crawl onto her designer shoes. Madison came from money, old Atlanta money that traced its roots back to railroad barons and cotton fortunes, the kind of wealth that was worn casually but displayed prominently in every detail of her appearance. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and she wielded it like a weapon that had been honed through years of social warfare. Everything about Madison was perfect. Her makeup applied with professional precision, her clothes chosen to display wealth without appearing gaudy, her posture and bearing that spoke of cotillion classes and finishing school. She was the kind of girl who had never doubted her place in the world, who had been told from birth that she was special, destined for greatness, deserving of whatever she wanted. "Oh my God, Trevor, look at that sweater," Madison said, her voice pitched loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear every syllable. The words were delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that could only come from someone who had never experienced it herself. "Did you fish that out of a donation bin? Or maybe it was floating in one of your swamps back home?" The third member of their trio, Blake Morrison, snickered as he pulled out his phone, the latest iPhone model that probably cost more than Kira's father made in 2 weeks at his new job as a night security guard. The wannabe influencer documented everything, constantly building his social media presence with carefully curated content designed to showcase his lifestyle and, increasingly, to humiliate those he deemed beneath his notice. Blake was different from Trevor and Madison in that his wealth was newer, his family having made their fortune in tech during the dot-com boom. His parents had bought their way into Atlanta's social elite, and Blake wore his inherited privilege like armor, always slightly overcompensating for the fact that his family didn't have the generational connections that opened doors automatically for the others. His carefully styled hair and designer clothes screamed of parents who bought him popularity rather than earning it, and he wore his cruelty like a badge of honor, proof that he belonged in the upper echelons of the high school hierarchy. He was already angling for the perfect shot to humiliate her online, his followers eagerly waiting for the next installment in what had become a regular series of Swamp Girl content. Kira tried to step around them, her movements careful and deliberate. She had learned to read the signs of impending confrontation, the subtle shifts in body language that indicated when casual mockery was about to escalate into something more deliberate. Trevor's shoulders were squared, his stance wide and aggressive. Madison's eyes held that particular glint that suggested she was looking for entertainment. Blake's phone was already recording, but Trevor shifted to block her path again, his movement casual but deliberate. "Now that's not very friendly," he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that carried clearly through the hallway. Other students were beginning to slow their pace, to linger by their lockers, or pretend to search through their backpacks while keeping their attention focused on the developing drama. "We're just trying to welcome you to our school, show some Southern hospitality. Isn't that what y'all are supposed to be good at?" The irony of being lectured about hospitality by someone who had made her life miserable for 3 months wasn't lost on Kira, but she bit back the sharp retort that rose to her lips. Papa's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that words spoken in anger often caused more harm than the original offense, that engaging with bullies on their terms only gave them more ammunition to use against her. "Maybe we should give her a makeover," Madison suggested, her eyes lighting up with malicious glee as an idea took shape. "I mean, that whole thrift store chic thing isn't really working for her. We could do something about that accent too. Speech therapy exists for a reason. The suggestion was delivered with the kind of false helpfulness that was somehow more cutting than outright insults. Madison had perfected the art of offering assistance while simultaneously emphasizing everything that was wrong with the person she was supposedly trying to help. It was a skill that required both intelligence and cruelty, and Madison possessed both in abundance. The hallway had begun to form a loose circle around them, other students slowing their pace to watch the show that was becoming increasingly common entertainment. Kira recognized some faces from her classes. Sarah from English, who had seemed friendly enough during group work, Marcus from history, who had once borrowed a pencil from her, Jennifer from art class, who had complimented her drawing skills. But none of them met her eyes now. They were content to be spectators to her humiliation, and their silent complicity stung almost as much as the words themselves. This was how it worked at Jefferson High, she had learned. There were the predators, the prey, and the vast majority who fell somewhere in between, willing to watch cruelty unfold as long as they weren't the targets. The social ecosystem required victims to function, someone to be at the bottom of the hierarchy so that everyone else could feel secure in their position above them. Kira had been designated to fill that role, and challenging it would mean risking their own safety. Kira's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke, the words coming out smaller than she intended. "I just want to get to class." The response felt inadequate, even as she said it. Too passive, too much like begging. But what was the alternative? Fighting back with words would only escalate the situation, give them more material to work with. Physical confrontation was out of the question. Papa's rules were clear about that, and besides, she was outnumbered and in full view of half the school. What was that? Trevor cupped his ear dramatically, his performance calculated to draw maximum attention from their audience. "Sorry, I don't speak by you. Could you repeat that in English for those of us who went to real schools?" The laughter that followed felt like needles against her skin, each chuckle and snicker a small wound that accumulated into something larger and more painful. Kira's hands tightened on her books until her knuckles went white, and for a moment she felt the familiar surge of controlled aggression that her grandfather had taught her to recognize and channel. The feeling was like electricity running through her limbs, a heightened awareness that made her acutely conscious of everyone's position, their balance, their vulnerabilities. Trevor's weight was slightly forward on his toes, making him vulnerable to a sweep. Madison was standing with her legs together, her center of gravity high, easy to topple. Blake was distracted by his phone, not watching for threats, but Papa's voice was stronger than the tactical assessments running through her mind, reminding her that fighting should be a last resort, used only when all other options were exhausted, when the threat was immediate and unavoidable. Words, no matter how cruel, didn't constitute that kind of threat. She tried once more to move around them, her path taking her toward the edge of their loose formation, where she might be able to slip past without further confrontation. But this time, Madison stepped forward with deliberate intent, her movement designed to look accidental while being anything but. Madison's shoulder connected with Kira's arm with more force than necessary. A collision that was clearly intentional despite the innocent expression that immediately followed. Kira's books scattered across the floor in a cascade of worn paper and dog-eared pages, her carefully organized notes for biology class mixing with homework assignments and the small sketch pad she carried everywhere. The sound of papers rustling mixed with the renewed laughter of their audience, and Kira felt heat rise in her cheeks as she watched weeks of careful work spread across the grimy hallway floor. Some of her papers were already being stepped on by passing students who either didn't notice or didn't care, leaving muddy footprints across her handwriting. "Oops," Madison said, her voice dripping with false concern as she pressed her hand to her chest in an exaggerated gesture of surprise. Sorry about that. Maybe you should watch where you're going, or maybe we should get you some glasses to go with that lovely outfit." As Kira knelt to gather her scattered belongings, she caught sight of someone in her peripheral vision who made her pause in her desperate scramble to recover her possessions. Danny Chen stood by his locker about 20 feet away, his camera hanging around his neck as it always did. The camera was old, not vintage, trendy old, but genuinely aged, a manual film camera that his grandfather had passed down to him, much like Papa had passed down his fighting skills to Kira. Danny was the quiet photographer for the school newspaper, the one who documented school events and activities with an artist's eye and a sensitivity that was rare among their peers. He was small for his age, maybe 5'6" and slight of build, with straight black hair that fell across his forehead and dark eyes that seemed to see more than most people realized. Something about his gentle demeanor and genuine smile had caught her attention from the first day when he had been photographing new students for the school website. Unlike the others, he had never laughed at her accent or made comments about her clothes. In fact, he'd been the only person to compliment her backpack, recognizing it as genuine vintage leather rather than cheap imitation. He had asked about its history with genuine interest, and she had found herself telling him about how it had belonged to her grandmother, how it had traveled from New Orleans to the Bayou and now to Atlanta. Their eyes met for just a moment across the hallway, and she saw something there that might have been concern, maybe even anger on her behalf. His hands were clenched around his camera strap, his usually gentle expression hardened into something she had never seen before. For a moment, she thought he might actually approach, might say something to intervene in what was happening. But before either of them could act, the warning bell rang, its shrill tone cutting through the noise of the hallway and sending students scrambling toward their first period classes. The crowd began to disperse with the reluctant disappointment of audiences everywhere when the entertainment ends too soon. "Better hurry up, Swamp Girl," Trevor called over his shoulder as he walked away with his companions, his voice carrying clearly over the noise of students changing classes. "Wouldn't want to be late on top of everything else. Some of us actually care about our academic records." The implication was clear, that someone like Kira, someone from where she came from, wouldn't understand the importance of punctuality and academic achievement. It was another small cut, another reminder that she was considered inferior in every way that mattered to them. Kira finished gathering her papers, stuffing them haphazardly into her backpack without bothering to organize them properly. Some were wrinkled, some were dirty, and she was pretty sure she was missing at least 2 pages of her biology notes. She would have to ask to borrow someone else's notes to copy, which meant admitting what had happened, which meant more humiliation. The next few weeks established a pattern that made Kira's stomach clench with dread every morning when she woke up in the small bedroom she shared with her younger sister Marie. The trio seemed to have an uncanny ability to find her wherever she went, as if they had installed some kind of tracking system that alerted them to her presence. In the cafeteria, they would walk past her table and make loud comments about the smell of her homemade lunch, wondering aloud whether swamp people ate different food than normal people. Her mother's carefully prepared meals, jambalaya made with leftover rice and whatever vegetables were on sale, po' boys constructed from day-old bread and lunch meat, stretched to feed 4 people, gumbo made from ingredients that cost less than a single meal from the cafeteria's premium line, became subjects of mockery. "What is that smell?" Madison would ask, in a voice pitched to carry across half the cafeteria. "Did someone bring roadkill for lunch? Maybe it's some kind of voodoo food," Blake would add, his phone already out to record reactions. "I heard they eat weird things in the swamp, alligator and stuff." The comments weren't just about the food itself, but about everything it represented: poverty, difference, otherness. The fact that her lunches were homemade rather than bought marked her as someone whose family couldn't afford the convenience that others took for granted. the unfamiliar spices and combinations that reflected her family's cultural heritage became evidence of her failure to assimilate, to become acceptably American. In the library, they would whisper just loud enough for her to hear about her outdated phone and worn backpack, making sure she understood that every aspect of her appearance was being catalogued and found wanting. Her phone was 3 years old, a basic model that made calls and sent texts, but couldn't handle the social media apps that seemed to consume her classmates' attention. Her backpack, for all its vintage appeal to someone like Danny, who appreciated quality craftsmanship, was obviously used, obviously not purchased new for the school year. "Did you see her trying to take notes on that ancient phone?" Madison would stage whisper to Blake. "I didn't know they still made phones that old. Maybe we should start a fundraiser to get her something from this century." "Poor thing probably can't afford the data plan anyway," Blake would respond, his voice carrying just far enough. "Not everyone can have unlimited everything, I guess." The worst incidents happened in the less supervised areas of the school, where teachers and administrators were less likely to witness what was happening and intervene. The stairwell between the second and third floors became a particular danger zone, a narrow space where Trevor could accidentally shoulder-check her into the wall, using his size advantage to make the collision look unintentional while ensuring it was hard enough to leave bruises. Madison would follow up these physical encounters with cutting remarks about her appearance that left Kira feeling small and worthless. "You might want to do something about those bruises," she would say with false concern. "People might think you're clumsy. Though I guess that's better than people thinking you're just pathetic." The psychological warfare was carefully calculated, designed to chip away at her self-esteem and sense of belonging. They never did anything quite dramatic enough to warrant official intervention, never crossed the line into obvious assault or harassment that would trigger the school's anti-bullying policies. Instead, they operated in the gray areas, the spaces between rules where cruelty could flourish under the guise of social interaction. But it was in the courtyard behind the gymnasium where things escalated beyond mere words and casual physical intimidation. The courtyard was officially part of the campus, but it was rarely supervised during lunch periods. Students who didn't want to deal with the chaos of the cafeteria or who needed space to study often ate there, enjoying the relative quiet and the shade provided by a handful of mature oak trees. Kira had been eating lunch alone at a picnic table, trying to lose herself in a paperback novel she had borrowed from the public library. The book was a fantasy novel about a girl who discovered she had magical powers, a story that offered temporary escape from the reality of her daily existence. She was deep in a passage about the protagonist learning to control her abilities when the shadow fell across her page again. "Reading alone again, I see," Trevor said, settling onto the bench across from her without invitation. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the quiet space, bringing with it the tension and threat that had become associated with his attention. Madison and Blake flanked him on either side, their expressions promising entertainment at her expense. The book suddenly felt fragile in her hands, like something precious that might be taken away and destroyed, just for the pleasure of watching her reaction. She closed it carefully, her fingers tracing the worn cover with its fantasy artwork of dragons and magical creatures, and set it aside where it might be safer. "You know, I've been thinking," Madison said, examining her perfectly manicured nails with the kind of attention most people reserved for important documents. Each nail was painted in a slightly different shade of pink, a designer technique that had probably cost more than Kira's family spent on food in a week. "There has to be a reason why you're so antisocial. I mean, normal people try to make friends." The word normal was delivered with particular emphasis, a reminder that Kira had been categorized as abnormal, as someone who existed outside the boundaries of acceptable teenage behavior. The implication was that her isolation was a choice, that her failure to integrate socially was a personal failing rather than the result of systematic exclusion and harassment. "Maybe she thinks she's too good for us," Blake suggested, his phone already recording, as he had trained himself to do whenever potential content presented itself. His social media following had grown substantially since he began documenting the swamp girl situation, as he had taken to calling it in his posts. "You know how some people get when they move to a better place. They think they're special." The accusation of superiority was particularly cruel because it was so completely opposite to her actual experience. Far from thinking herself too good for them, Kira spent most of her time feeling inadequate, wondering what was wrong with her that made her such an easy target, questioning every aspect of herself from her appearance to her accent to her family's financial situation. Kira closed her book slowly, her fingers tracing the worn cover one more time before she looked up at them. "I'm not bothering anyone. I just want to eat lunch." The words came out stronger than she had intended, with less of the apologetic tone that usually characterized her interactions with them. Maybe it was the book. Stories of characters who learned to fight back had a way of seeping into one's consciousness. Maybe it was simple exhaustion, with the constant vigilance required to navigate their attention. Whatever the reason, the slight edge in her voice was enough to make Trevor's expression harden. "See? There's that attitude again," Trevor said, his voice taking on a dangerous quality that made the hair on the back of Kira's neck stand up. "You come to our school, you eat our food, you breathe our air, and you can't even be bothered to be social. That's not how things work around here." The possessive language was telling, our school, our food, our air, as if the entire environment belonged to him personally, and she existed there only by his sufferance. It was the kind of territorial marking that spoke to deeper insecurities about control and dominance, the need to establish and maintain hierarchy through intimidation and exclusion. The confrontation might have ended there, as it usually did, with Kira packing up her things and finding somewhere else to go, surrendering the territory and reinforcing her position at the bottom of the social order. She was already reaching for her backpack, already planning her retreat to the safety of the library or an empty classroom where she could finish her lunch in peace. But then Danny appeared at the edge of the courtyard, his camera bag slung over his shoulder and his expression troubled. He had been photographing the school's garden project for the newspaper, documenting the progress of various plants and the student volunteers who tended them. His presence in the courtyard wasn't unusual, but his timing felt like divine intervention. "Hey, Kira," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the space with a warmth that cut through the tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "I was looking for you. Mrs. Peterson wanted to know if you'd be interested in helping with the literary magazine. She said your essay about Louisiana was really good." The simple act of someone acknowledging her existence, let alone praising her work, sent a warm flutter through Kira's chest that she hadn't felt since leaving home. Mrs. Peterson was the English teacher who had assigned the essay about their hometowns, and Kira had written about the cypress swamps of her childhood, about the way Spanish moss filtered sunlight and created cathedral spaces in nature, about the rich cultural heritage that had shaped her family's traditions. She had poured her heart into that essay, trying to capture not just the physical beauty of her homeland, but the sense of belonging and identity that came from being part of something larger than herself. The fact that Mrs. Peterson had not only read it carefully, but found it worthy of praise was a validation she desperately needed. Danny's smile was genuine, unmarked by the calculating cruelty that characterized so many interactions at Jefferson High. His dark eyes held warmth and what looked like genuine admiration, and for a moment, Kira forgot about the three predators sitting across from her. "I'd like that," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. The words carried a note of hope that surprised even her. The possibility that there might be spaces at this school where her contributions were valued, where she could be more than just a target for others' entertainment. But Trevor's expression had darkened at the interruption, his territorial instincts triggered by someone daring to interfere with what he clearly considered his domain. The arrival of a witness, particularly one who seemed inclined to treat Kira as a human being rather than an object of ridicule, disrupted the carefully constructed dynamic that allowed the harassment to continue unchallenged. "Well, well, looks like Swamp Girl found herself a boyfriend," Trevor said, his voice carrying the kind of mocking tone that suggested this development was somehow both amusing and pathetic. The word boyfriend was loaded with implication, suggesting that Danny's kindness was motivated by romantic interest rather than simple human decency. "Danny, right?" Madison's voice took on a sickeningly sweet tone, the kind of false friendliness that was somehow more threatening than outright hostility. She had perfected this particular weapon over years of social warfare, the ability to sound helpful while delivering devastating cuts. "You probably don't realize this, but you're talking to the school's charity case. We were just trying to help her understand how things work around here." The phrase charity case was calculated to wound both Kira and Danny, reducing her to nothing more than an object of pity, while simultaneously questioning his motives for treating her kindly. It was a masterpiece of social manipulation, designed to make both of them feel small and ashamed, while positioning Madison as the helpful insider, providing valuable information. Danny's jaw tightened, and Kira saw his hands clench around his camera strap with enough force to leave impressions in the worn leather. His usually gentle demeanor was hardening into something she had never seen before, a quiet anger that transformed his features and made him seem older, more serious. "Looks to me like you're just being cruel for no reason," Danny said, his voice steady despite the obvious tension running through his small frame. The words were delivered with the kind of moral certainty that came from someone who had never doubted the difference between right and wrong, who hadn't yet learned to compromise his principles for social acceptance. Cruel. Trevor stood up, his considerable height advantage making him loom over the smaller boy in a display of physical intimidation that was as old as human conflict. The movement was calculated to remind everyone present of the power dynamics at play, of who had the physical capability to enforce their will if words weren't sufficient. "We're being educational. Someone needs to teach both of you about respect." The word respect was particularly ironic, coming from someone who had shown nothing but contempt for Kira since her arrival. But Trevor delivered it with complete sincerity. In his worldview, respect was something that flowed upward in the social hierarchy, something that people like Kira owed to people like him, simply by virtue of their relative positions. The idea that respect might be earned rather than demanded, or that it might flow in multiple directions, was foreign to his understanding of how the world worked. The confrontation escalated quickly from there, the careful social dynamics that usually constrain teenage conflict beginning to break down under the pressure of competing territorial claims and wounded pride. Blake continued recording, his phone capturing every moment for later distribution across social media platforms, where the drama would be dissected and analyzed by their classmates. Trevor stepped closer to Danny, using his size to intimidate, his broad shoulders and imposing height creating a physical presence that was designed to make the smaller boy back down. It was a technique that had worked countless times before, the simple application of implied physical threat to resolve social conflicts in his favor. Madison made cutting remarks about Danny's white knight complex and suggested that maybe he and Kira deserved each other since they were both weird, her voice carrying the particular venom that came from someone unused to having their authority challenged. The suggestion that Danny might be romantically interested in Kira was delivered as an insult, the implication being that only someone equally damaged would find her attractive. But it was when Trevor shoved Danny, his large hands making contact with the smaller boy's chest and sending him stumbling backward, that something fundamental shifted in the courtyard behind Jefferson High School. Danny's arms windmilled as he fought to maintain his balance, his camera bag swinging wildly as he nearly dropped the precious equipment that represented not just his hobby, but his identity as the school photographer. The push itself wasn't particularly violent. Trevor had used just enough force to make his point without crossing the line into obvious assault. But it represented an escalation that changed the nature of the conflict. Words could be dismissed, ignored, rationalized away, but physical contact was unambiguous in its intent and meaning. Something shifted in Kira's chest as she watched Danny struggle to regain his footing, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. The familiar surge of controlled aggression rose up, but this time it came with a clarity that hadn't been there before when she was the sole target of their attention. This wasn't about her anymore, wasn't about the accumulated humiliations and daily cruelties that she had learned to endure in silence. They were threatening the one person who had shown her kindness since arriving at Jefferson High, the only student who had treated her as a human being rather than an object of ridicule. Danny had defended her when no one else would, had risked his own social standing by associating with her publicly, and now he was paying the price for his decency. That crossed a line she hadn't even known existed until it was violated. Papa's teachings had always been clear about the distinction between personal offense and genuine threat, between enduring hardship for the sake of peace and allowing evil to flourish through inaction. Watching someone else suffer because they had chosen to be kind to her activated protective instincts that ran deeper than social expectations or personal safety. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled in a way that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with training in martial arts. Her grandfather's lessons had taught her that the transition from peaceful resolution to physical action should never be rushed or careless, that the decision to use force required both moral certainty and tactical preparation. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice carrying a quality that made Madison take a half step backward without realizing it. The words weren't shouted or delivered with obvious aggression, but they carried an undertone of absolute conviction that cut through the casual cruelty of the moment like a blade through silk. Trevor turned to her with a laugh, his confidence unshaken by the subtle change in her demeanor. He had grown accustomed to intimidating people through size and social position, and nothing in Kira's appearance suggested that she might represent any kind of genuine threat. She was still small, still wearing second-hand clothes, still marked by all the social indicators that had made her an easy target for months. "Oh, now you want to play protector?" Trevor said, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that was both mocking and threatening. "That's rich. What are you going to do about it, swamp girl?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be taken back, a line drawn in the social sand that demanded response. For months, Kira had absorbed similar challenges, had found ways to deflect and avoid rather than engage. But this time was different. This time, the stakes were higher than her own comfort or social standing. For a moment, Kira felt the weight of her grandfather's teachings pressing down on her like a physical force. The countless hours of training, the discipline he had instilled in her through repetition and philosophy, the responsibility that came with knowing how to hurt people effectively and efficiently. Papa had been clear that such knowledge came with obligations, that the ability to inflict harm created a duty to use it only when absolutely necessary. But she also felt the accumulated weight of weeks of humiliation, the sting of being treated as less than human, and the protective fury that came from seeing someone she cared about being threatened for the crime of showing her kindness. The combination of personal injury and protective instinct created a perfect storm of justified anger that Papa's training had prepared her to channel productively. "I'm asking you nicely," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through her system like electricity through copper wire. "Please leave us alone." The word "please" was delivered without pleading, without the submissive tone that might have characterized her earlier attempts at de-escalation. Instead, it carried the weight of a final warning, the last opportunity for peaceful resolution before other options became necessary. Anyone with experience in genuine conflict would have recognized the signs. The controlled breathing, the balanced stance, the way her hands had unconsciously shifted into positions that could transition quickly to defensive or offensive techniques. Trevor's response was to laugh and turn back toward Danny, dismissing her warning as empty posturing from someone who had never shown any inclination toward physical confrontation. "You know what, picture boy? I think you need to learn some respect, too." The dismissal was complete, the kind of casual disregard that came from someone who had never encountered meaningful opposition to their will. Trevor had learned to navigate the world through intimidation and social pressure, tools that had proven effective in the carefully controlled environment of suburban high school life. The possibility that someone might respond with actual force, particularly someone as seemingly harmless as Kira, was outside his experience and therefore outside his consideration. What happened next moved with the fluid inevitability of a dance Kira had practiced 1,000 times, her body responding to threat with the automatic precision that came from years of disciplined training. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind as she stepped forward, her body shifting into a stance that was simultaneously relaxed and ready, balanced and dynamic. "Violence is never the first choice, Cher," she could hear Papa saying in his gravelly voice, weathered by years and experience. "But sometimes it's the only choice that matters. When words fail and retreat isn't possible, when innocent people are threatened by those who would do them harm, then the body must do what the mind cannot accomplish." Trevor's hand was reaching for Danny's camera, his fingers already extended to grab the precious equipment that represented not just monetary value, but emotional significance to the quiet photographer. The gesture was designed to humiliate and damage, to destroy something important to his victim as a demonstration of power and control. It was the kind of casual cruelty that characterized all of his interactions with those he considered beneath him. But Kira moved faster than anyone in that courtyard had ever seen her move, her small frame suddenly fluid and purposeful in a way that transformed her from victim to something entirely different. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it took several seconds for the observers to process what they were seeing. Her grandfather's training had emphasized economy of motion, the importance of using an opponent's expectations and assumptions against them. Someone Trevor's size would expect physical confrontation to begin with obvious aggression, with wild swings and clumsy grappling, that his advantages in reach and weight would allow him to counter easily. He wasn't prepared for the kind of precise, controlled violence that Kira had been taught to deliver. Her palm strike caught him in the solar plexus with surgical precision, the impact delivered with perfect timing and placement to drive the air from his lungs without causing permanent injury. The technique was designed to incapacitate rather than destroy, to create immediate tactical advantage without escalating to the kind of serious harm that would require medical intervention or legal consequences. The impact sent Trevor stumbling backward, his confident expression shifting from casual cruelty to shocked surprise in the space of a heartbeat. His large frame, which had been his primary weapon in social conflicts, suddenly became a liability as he struggled to maintain his balance and process what had just happened to him. "What the hell?" he gasped, his voice reduced to a wheeze as his diaphragm spasmed and refused to function properly. The words came out strangled and weak, completely different from the commanding tone he had used just moments before. For the first time in his life, Trevor Holloway found himself physically dominated by someone smaller and seemingly weaker than himself. Madison's perfectly composed facade cracked like expensive makeup in summer heat, her usual poise deserting her as she witnessed something that didn't fit into her understanding of how the world worked. In her experience, people like Kira were victims by nature, passive recipients of whatever treatment their social superiors chose to deliver. The idea that such a person might fight back, might possess skills that could threaten her allies, was so foreign to her worldview that it took several seconds to register. "Trevor, get up!" she shouted, her voice carrying a note of panic that she had never heard from herself before. "She just got lucky. Do something!" But Trevor was already moving forward again, his embarrassment and wounded pride overriding any rational assessment of the situation he now faced. The humiliation of being knocked down by someone like Kira in front of an audience was more than his ego could absorb passively. His entire identity was built on physical and social dominance, and having that dominance challenged so publicly required immediate and decisive response. He swung widely, telegraphing the punch in a way that would have made Kira's grandfather shake his head in disappointment at the obvious amateur technique. Trevor's fighting experience was limited to intimidation and the occasional scuffle with other large, untrained teenagers. He had never faced someone with real skill, someone who understood leverage and timing and the dozen other factors that determined the outcome of physical conflict. Kira ducked under his arm with fluid grace, her movement so smooth and natural that it looked almost choreographed. In the same motion, she swept his legs, using his own momentum and weight against him to send him crashing to the ground with a satisfying thud that seemed to echo across the courtyard. The technique was basic Brazilian jiu-jitsu, one of the first takedowns Papa had taught her when she was still small enough to ride on his shoulders. But executed properly against an opponent who didn't understand what was happening, it was devastatingly effective. Trevor's size became a disadvantage rather than an asset, making his fall harder and more jarring than it would have been for a smaller person. Blake had stopped recording, his phone forgotten in his hand, as he stared at the scene unfolding before him with the kind of stunned disbelief that came from watching reality deviate completely from expectation. His carefully curated social media presence was built on documenting the humiliation of others, but this particular humiliation was flowing in the wrong direction entirely. "Holy shit," he breathed, the words escaping him without conscious thought. The profanity was mild by teenage standards, but the reverent way he delivered it suggested that he was witnessing something significant, something that would be talked about and analyzed for weeks to come. The sound of Trevor hitting the ground seemed to break whatever spell had held the small crowd of onlookers who had been drawn by the commotion. Students began to emerge from the edges of the courtyard, some with their phones out and already recording what promised to be the most talked-about incident of the semester. The confrontation was transitioning from private harassment to public spectacle, with all the social implications that such visibility entailed. Trevor struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage that went beyond simple anger into something more primal and dangerous. His carefully maintained image as the dominant force in his social environment had been shattered in front of witnesses, and the psychological damage was potentially more significant than any physical harm he had suffered. "You think you're tough," he snarled, dirt from the courtyard clinging to his expensive clothes and making him look disheveled and undignified. "You think you can just—" He charged forward again, and this time Kira didn't hesitate or attempt further de-escalation. Her grandfather had taught her that once a fight began, you finished it quickly and decisively before adrenaline and anger could escalate the situation beyond control. Prolonged conflict increased the risk of serious injury to everyone involved and made it more likely that someone would cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. She sidestepped his clumsy rush with the kind of precise timing that came from thousands of hours of practice, grabbed his arm as he passed, and used his own momentum to send him sprawling across the courtyard in a throw that combined elements of judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. The technique was beautiful in its simplicity and effectiveness, a perfect demonstration of how skill could overcome size and aggression. "Stay down," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of accomplishing. The words weren't delivered as a threat or a boast, but as a simple statement of fact, a professional assessment of the tactical situation that had developed. But Trevor was beyond reason now, his pride and identity so thoroughly damaged that rational thought had become impossible. In his mind, accepting defeat at the hands of someone like Kira would mean social death, the complete destruction of his position in the high school hierarchy. Better to risk physical injury than face the psychological consequences of acknowledging her superiority. He came at her again, and this time Blake joined him, apparently deciding that 2 against 1 offered better odds than watching his friend be systematically dismantled by a girl half his size. Blake's involvement changed the nature of the conflict, transforming it from a simple case of bullying into something more serious and potentially dangerous. What followed was a display of controlled violence that left everyone watching in stunned silence, a demonstration of skill and training that most of them had only seen in movies or professional fighting competitions. Kira moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft, her body shifting and flowing around their attacks like water around stones. Every strike was precise, every movement calculated for maximum effect with minimum effort. She used their size against them, their aggression against them, their expectations against them. They came at her with the raw force that had always worked for them before, and found themselves fighting someone who understood that force without technique was just wasted energy. Blake went down first, a perfectly executed hip throw that sent him tumbling across the grass in a way that looked almost gentle despite its effectiveness. The technique was designed to control and subdue rather than injure, but Blake stayed down anyway, clutching his shoulder and staring at Kira with something approaching awe rather than anger. Trevor lasted longer, his size and natural athleticism making him a more challenging opponent despite his lack of training. But size meant nothing when facing someone who understood leverage, timing, and anatomy in the way that Kira had been taught to understand them. Every advantage he thought he possessed, reach, weight, strength, became irrelevant when deployed against someone who knew how to neutralize such advantages. Kira caught his next punch with a block that redirected his force rather than opposing it directly, twisted his arm behind his back in a control hold that Papa had taught her when she was 12, and drove him face first into the ground with authority that left no doubt about the outcome of their confrontation. For a moment, she held him there, his arm hyperextended just to the point of pain, but not injury, demonstrating complete control over someone who had terrorized her for months. This was the moment her grandfather had always warned her about, the moment when the power to hurt someone completely was in her hands, and the temptation to use it was almost overwhelming. She could feel the tremor in Trevor's arm as she maintained the submission hold, knew that one more twist would break it cleanly, would give her the kind of definitive victory that would ensure he never bothered her again. The knowledge was intoxicating, the absolute certainty that she could inflict the kind of injury that would require surgery and months of rehabilitation, that would leave him with permanent reminders of what happened when someone pushed her too far. But Papa's voice was stronger than her anger, stronger than the accumulated humiliation of months of harassment, stronger than the satisfying prospect of complete and total revenge. The moment you become the thing you hate, Cher, You've lost more than any fight could ever cost you. The moment you use your skills for revenge rather than protection, you become no different from those who would harm the innocent." She could hear him as clearly as if he were standing beside her in the courtyard, his weathered face serious as he delivered one of the most important lessons she would ever learn. Violence was a tool, and like any tool, its morality was determined by how it was used. Used to protect herself and others, it was righteous. Used for revenge or to inflict unnecessary harm, it became something else entirely. She released his arm and stepped back, her breathing steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system like liquid fire. Trevor rolled over, his face a mask of pain and humiliation, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Genuine fear, mixed with what might have been respect. The courtyard had fallen silent, except for the sound of their breathing and the distant noise of normal school life continuing around them. The other students who had gathered to watch were processing what they had seen, trying to reconcile the quiet, invisible girl they thought they knew with the skilled fighter who had just dismantled two larger opponents with apparent ease. "I don't want to fight you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard to everyone who had gathered to watch. "I never wanted to fight any of you. I just wanted to be left alone." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of months of accumulated frustration and pain. They were delivered without anger or gloating, just a quiet statement of truth from someone who had been pushed past her breaking point and found reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Madison, who had been frozen in shock during the entire confrontation, finally found her voice as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. "You're crazy. You're absolutely crazy." The words came out shrill and desperate, lacking the controlled cruelty that usually characterized her verbal attacks. "No," Kira said, turning to face the girl who had tormented her for weeks with cutting remarks and calculated humiliations. "I'm tired. I'm tired of being treated like I'm not human. I'm tired of being laughed at and pushed around and made to feel like I don't belong anywhere." She looked around at the faces staring at her, some shocked, some impressed, some frightened by the sudden revelation that the quiet girl they had ignored or mocked was capable of such decisive action. The social dynamics that had governed Jefferson High School for years had just been fundamentally altered, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant. "I never asked for any of this," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of everything she was saying. "I just wanted to go to school and learn and maybe make a friend or two, but you decided I was an easy target, and you were wrong." The admission was honest and vulnerable in a way that cut through the usual teenage posturing and pretense. She wasn't boasting about her victory or threatening further violence. She was simply explaining with painful clarity what had led to this moment and why she had finally chosen to respond with force. Danny stepped forward, his camera forgotten, his expression mixing admiration with concern as he approached someone who had just revealed depths he hadn't suspected. "Kira, are you okay?" The simple question, asked with such genuine care and concern, almost broke her composure completely. After months of being treated as less than human, having someone ask about her welfare with authentic concern was almost more overwhelming than the physical confrontation had been. She nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight was beginning to fade, replaced by a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty about what the consequences of her actions might be. She had defended herself and Danny, had demonstrated that she wouldn't accept unlimited abuse, but she had also crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. There would be repercussions, official and unofficial, that she would have to deal with in the days and weeks to come. Trevor struggled to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate as he tested his various joints and muscles for damage. His face was a mixture of pain and something that might have been respect, a grudging acknowledgement that he had severely underestimated his opponent. When he spoke, his voice was different from the mocking tone he had used earlier, more serious and thoughtful. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing the casual cruelty that had characterized all of their previous interactions. The question was asked without hostility, as if he was trying to understand how someone he had categorized as weak and helpless had proven so devastatingly effective in physical confrontation. "My grandfather," she said simply, her voice carrying the affection and respect that always colored any mention of Papa. "He taught me that fighting should be a last resort. But when someone threatens the people you care about, sometimes it's the only option." The explanation was honest without being boastful, acknowledging both the source of her skills and the moral framework that governed their use. It wasn't a threat or a warning, just a simple statement of fact that helped explain how a seemingly powerless target had turned the tables so completely on her tormentors. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse as the sound of approaching footsteps indicated that faculty members were finally arriving to investigate the commotion. News traveled fast in high school environments, and it was inevitable that word of the fight would reach official attention. But the damage was done, and everyone who had witnessed the confrontation knew that the social dynamics of Jefferson High had shifted permanently and irreversibly. In the weeks that followed the confrontation in the courtyard, Kira found herself navigating a completely different school environment than the one she had endured for the first 3 months of her time at Jefferson High. The change was immediate and profound, as if someone had adjusted the fundamental physics of teenage social interaction overnight. The whispers that followed her through the hallways now carried undertones of respect rather than mockery, a complete reversal of the social dynamics that had made her life miserable since her arrival from Louisiana. Where once students had treated her as invisible or, worse, as entertainment, now they acknowledged her presence with nods and careful politeness that spoke to a newfound wariness about crossing someone who had proven capable of defending herself so effectively. "Did you see what she did to Trevor?" became a common refrain in conversations she wasn't supposed to overhear, delivered with the kind of awed respect usually reserved for legendary athletic performances or particularly impressive acts of teenage rebellion. The story of the fight had grown in the telling, as such stories always do, with each retelling adding new details and embellishments that enhanced the dramatic impact. Students who had never acknowledged her existence before now nodded politely when they passed her in the corridors, their gestures carrying the careful respect of people who had learned not to underestimate others based on appearance alone. The social invisibility that had once been a source of pain and isolation became a form of protection, as most of her classmates seemed content to acknowledge her from a distance rather than risk closer interaction. The videos of the fight had spread through social media faster than wildfire, uploaded and shared across multiple platforms within hours of the confrontation. The footage, shot from multiple angles by various students who had been present, showed the incident from different perspectives but told the same basic story. The quiet girl from Louisiana had systematically defeated 2 larger opponents with skills that seemed almost supernatural to viewers who had no background in martial arts. The narrative that emerged wasn't about a violent outburst or unprovoked attack, but about someone finally standing up to bullies who had gone too far. The context was important. The videos clearly showed Trevor and Blake as the aggressors, showed the escalation from verbal harassment to physical intimidation to outright assault. Kira's response, while dramatic and decisive, was clearly defensive in nature. Comments on the posts ranged from amazement at her fighting skills to approval of her decision to fight back, with very few expressing sympathy for Trevor and his companions. The consensus seemed to be that they had gotten what they deserved, that their months of harassment had finally met appropriate consequence. For once, the social media machinery that usually amplified teenage cruelty was working in favor of justice rather than entertainment. Trevor, Madison, and Blake kept their distance in the aftermath, their former confidence replaced by a wary respect that fundamentally altered the power dynamics between them. Trevor, in particular, seemed to be processing the experience on multiple levels, dealing not just with the physical defeat, but with the complete reversal of his understanding of strength and dominance. His arm was sore for several days, a constant reminder of how completely he had been controlled by someone he had categorized as powerless. But more than the physical discomfort was the psychological impact of discovering that his assumptions about the world were fundamentally flawed, that people who appeared weak might possess hidden strengths that could neutralize his advantages completely. Madison struggled with the aftermath in her own way, her careful social positioning suddenly rendered meaningless by the dramatic shift in school dynamics. Her power had always been derived from alliance with physical strength and social popularity, but both had proven inadequate against someone who operated by entirely different rules. The cutting remarks and calculated cruelties that had been her primary weapons seemed petty and ineffective in the face of Kira's demonstrated capability for decisive action. Blake's social media empire had taken an unexpected hit as the videos of the fight circulated. What he had intended to document as another humiliation of the Swamp Girl had instead become evidence of his own defeat and humiliation. His followers were more interested in discussing Kira's fighting skills than celebrating his usual content, and several sponsors had quietly distanced themselves from association with someone who appeared to be a documented bully. More importantly, for Kira's daily experience, her friendship with Danny had deepened into something more meaningful and substantial than the casual acquaintance it had been before the confrontation. The shared experience of the fight, his witness to her vulnerability and strength, had created a bond that went beyond simple teenage friendship into something approaching genuine partnership. They spent their lunch periods together now, talking about photography and literature and the small dreams that made high school bearable. Danny's gentle nature and artistic sensibility complemented Kira's quiet strength and protective instincts in ways that surprised both of them. He had been there in the courtyard when she needed someone to defend, and she had been there when he needed protection, creating a reciprocal relationship built on mutual respect and care. "Your grandfather sounds like an amazing man," Danny said one afternoon, as they sat in the same courtyard where everything had changed, the setting now holding completely different associations for both of them. The space that had once been a site of harassment and confrontation had become a refuge where they could talk freely without fear of interruption or judgment. Danny had been listening to Kira tell stories about Papa, about the lessons he had taught her, and the philosophy that guided his approach to martial arts and life in general. The old man's wisdom seemed to resonate with Danny's own gentle approach to the world, his belief that strength should be used to protect rather than dominate, that true power came from understanding and discipline rather than raw force. "He is," Kira agreed, her voice carrying the warmth and affection that always colored any mention of her grandfather. "He always said that strength isn't about being able to hurt people. It's about knowing when not to, and having the courage to act when it matters." The philosophy was simple but profound, a moral framework that had guided her through the most challenging period of her young life and would continue to shape her decisions in the future. Papa's teachings weren't just about fighting techniques or physical conditioning, but about character and responsibility and the careful balance between strength and restraint. "I've been thinking about what happened," Danny continued, his dark eyes serious as he processed the events that had brought them closer together. About how long you put up with their harassment before you finally fought back. Most people would have snapped much sooner. The observation was perceptive, touching on something that Kira herself had been considering in the weeks since the confrontation. She had endured months of systematic cruelty before finally responding with force, had exhausted every other option for dealing with the situation before resorting to physical confrontation. The restraint had been deliberate, guided by Papa's teachings about the proper use of violence, but it had also extracted a psychological toll that was only now becoming apparent. Papa always said that the hardest part of knowing how to fight isn't learning the techniques, she said slowly, working through thoughts that had been developing over time. It's learning when to use them and when not to. Anyone can throw a punch when they're angry, but it takes real discipline to not throw a punch when you could. The distinction was important, the difference between reactive violence born of emotion and deliberate action taken after careful consideration of alternatives and consequences. Kira's response to Trevor and Blake hadn't been an explosion of rage or frustration, but a calculated decision made when all other options had been exhausted and the safety of someone she cared about was threatened. 3 months after the confrontation, as spring began to transform the Georgia landscape and the academic year moved toward its conclusion, Trevor approached her table in the cafeteria during lunch period. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as he stood there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his expression unreadable, but notably lacking the arrogance and casual cruelty that had once characterized his interactions with her. The cafeteria had become a kind of neutral ground in the aftermath of the fight, a space where the new social dynamics played out under the watchful eyes of students who were still processing the dramatic changes that had occurred. Kira had continued eating lunch there, refusing to be driven away by the memory of past harassment, but the experience was completely different now. "Can I sit?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the mocking tone that had once made her stomach clench with anxiety. The request was genuine, almost humble, a far cry from the entitled demands and casual disrespect that had characterized all of their previous interactions. Kira nodded, curious about what he might have to say, and willing to listen despite everything that had passed between them. The weeks since their fight had given her time to process her own actions and emotions, to move beyond the immediate satisfaction of victory toward a more complex understanding of the situation and its aftermath. Trevor settled onto the bench across from her with careful movements, as if he was conscious of taking up space that wasn't automatically his by right. The change in his demeanor was striking. Where once he had dominated any space he entered through sheer physical presence and social confidence, now he seemed almost tentative, aware that his previous assumptions about power and dominance had been fundamentally challenged. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said slowly, his words carefully chosen and delivered without the casual arrogance that had once made every sentence sound like a command or judgment. "About what I did, what we did, and I wanted to say I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between them like something fragile and valuable, unexpected enough that several nearby conversations slowed as other students strained to hear what was being said. Apologies weren't common currency in the high school social economy, particularly not from someone of Trevor's social standing to someone who had previously been considered beneath notice. "I don't know why I thought it was okay to treat you like that," he continued, his expression thoughtful as he worked through ideas that were clearly still developing in his mind. "I guess I thought. I don't know what I thought. Maybe that because you were different, because you didn't fit in the way everyone else did, that somehow made it okay to..." He trailed off, struggling with concepts that he had never been forced to examine before. The casual cruelty that had seemed natural and justified when directed at someone he considered inferior was harder to rationalize when faced with the reality of that person's humanity and capability. The fight had forced him to confront the fact that his victim was a complete human being with her own strength, dignity, and moral agency. "But you were right to stand up for yourself," he said finally, the words coming out with the weight of genuine conviction. "You were right to fight back. I wish it hadn't had to come to that." The sentiment was honest and vulnerable in a way that surprised both of them. Trevor was acknowledging not just that his behavior had been wrong, but that the consequences had been appropriate and deserved. It was the kind of moral development that was rarely seen in teenagers, the ability to look beyond wounded pride and social embarrassment to genuine understanding of right and wrong. "Fighting back was never the point," Kira said quietly, her voice carrying the same thoughtful tone that characterized most of her conversations with people willing to engage her as an equal human being. "The point was that I shouldn't have needed to." The response was simple but profound, cutting to the heart of the moral issues that the entire situation had raised. Violence, even defensive violence, was never the ideal solution to conflict. The real tragedy wasn't that she had been forced to fight, but that the systematic harassment and cruelty had continued long enough to make fighting necessary. Trevor nodded slowly, his expression showing that he understood and accepted the point she was making. Yeah, I get that now." The acknowledgement was complete and unqualified, without the defensive qualifications or justifications that might have been expected from someone trying to minimize their responsibility. He was accepting full moral responsibility for the situation that had developed, recognizing that his actions had created the circumstances that led to the confrontation. He stood up to leave, his movement careful and respectful rather than the dominant assertion of presence that had once characterized his departure from any social situation. But he paused before walking away, one more thought occurring to him that needed to be expressed. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than any hint of threat or challenge, "I'm glad you didn't break my arm. You could have, couldn't you?" The question was asked with the kind of professional interest that one skilled practitioner might show for another's technique, a recognition that what had happened in the courtyard wasn't luck or accident, but the result of genuine skill and training. He was acknowledging implicitly that she had shown restraint even in victory, that her response had been measured rather than vindictive. "Yes," Kira said simply, her honesty uncompromising, but delivered without boastfulness or threat. The admission was a statement of fact, rather than intimidation, acknowledgement of capability without any suggestion that such capability would be used inappropriately. "But you didn't," Trevor said, his tone suggesting that he found this restraint more impressive than the fighting skills themselves. "That says something about who you are." The observation was perceptive, recognizing that the choice not to inflict unnecessary harm was more significant than the ability to do so. It showed an understanding that true strength was measured not by the damage one could cause, but by the wisdom to know when causing damage was appropriate and when it wasn't. As he walked away, Kira felt a sense of completion that had been missing since the confrontation in the courtyard. She had stood up for herself without losing her humanity, had shown strength without becoming cruel, had earned respect without becoming feared. The moral framework that Papa had taught her had been tested under the most challenging circumstances she had yet faced, and it had proven sound. The final bell rang, signaling the end of another day at Jefferson High School and the beginning of the journey home to the small apartment where her family was still rebuilding their lives after the upheaval of moving to Atlanta. As she walked through the hallways toward her locker, Kira reflected on how much had changed since those first terrifying weeks when every day had been a struggle for basic dignity and survival. The hallways that had once felt like gauntlets of potential humiliation now seemed like ordinary spaces where teenagers moved between classes and socialized according to the complex but comprehensible rules of adolescent society. She still wore thrift store clothes and spoke with a Creole accent that marked her as different from most of her classmates. But those differences no longer marked her as a target for ridicule or abuse. Instead, they were simply part of who she was, aspects of her identity that she wore with quiet pride rather than shame or defensiveness. The fight in the courtyard had taught her classmates that she was not someone who could be victimized with impunity, but more importantly, it had taught her that she didn't need to change herself to deserve basic respect and human dignity. Danny was waiting by her locker when she arrived, his camera bag slung over his shoulder and a genuine smile on his face that never failed to warm her heart. Their friendship had become one of the most valuable things in her life, a relationship built on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than the casual cruelty or social convenience that seemed to characterize so many teenage relationships. "Ready to go?" he asked, his voice carrying the comfortable familiarity of someone who had become genuinely important to her daily experience of the world. They had developed a routine of walking together toward the bus stop, using the time to discuss the day's events and plan for future projects they might work on together for the school newspaper and literary magazine. "Ready?" she said, shouldering her backpack and feeling the comfortable weight of books and supplies that represented progress toward her educational goals, rather than weapons in a daily battle for survival and dignity. As they walked toward the exit, passing through hallways where she was now acknowledged as a complete human being, rather than an object of entertainment or ridicule, Kira thought about the lesson her grandfather had tried to teach her all those years ago in their practice sessions in Louisiana, and later in the small apartment that had become their refuge in Atlanta. Violence was never the first choice, Papa had always insisted, but sometimes it was the only choice that mattered. More importantly, the real strength lay in knowing the difference, in having the courage to act when necessary while maintaining the wisdom to recognize when action was required and when it wasn't. But the most important lesson, the one that had been reinforced by her experience at Jefferson High School, was that she should never lose sight of who she was in the process of defending herself. The techniques Papa had taught her were tools, and like any tools, their moral value was determined by how they were used. Used to protect herself and others, they were righteous. Used for revenge or to inflict unnecessary harm, they became something else entirely. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as they walked toward the bus stop. Two students who had found each other in the chaos of high school hierarchy and discovered that genuine friendship was possible even in an environment that often seemed designed to promote cruelty and competition over compassion and cooperation. Behind them, Jefferson High School stood silent and imposing against the Georgia sky, its brick facade and institutional architecture unchanged by the dramatic events that had taken place within its walls. But for Kira, it no longer felt like a prison where she was condemned to serve time until graduation finally freed her to pursue her real life elsewhere. It was just a building filled with people learning how to be human, making mistakes in the process of growing up, and sometimes, if they were lucky and willing to do the hard work of self-examination and moral development, learning from those mistakes. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still students who treated others cruelly, still social dynamics that rewarded conformity over authenticity, still pressures that made adolescence a challenging time for anyone who didn't fit easily into predetermined categories. But the building held different possibilities now, represented different potential futures than it had during those first awful months when every day had been a struggle for basic survival and dignity. It was a place where she could learn and grow and prepare for the adult life that awaited her beyond graduation, where her differences were sources of strength rather than vulnerability, where her skills and character had been tested and proven sound. The bus ride home took them through suburban Atlanta neighborhoods that were still foreign to her in many ways. Different from the bayou communities where she had spent her childhood, but no longer actively hostile to her presence. The city was large enough to accommodate many different kinds of people, many different approaches to life and culture. And she was beginning to understand that there might be a place for her here after all. At home, her family was still adjusting to their new circumstances, still dealing with the financial and emotional challenges of starting over in a new place. Her father had found work, but it paid less than his previous job and required him to work nights, disrupting the family rhythms they had maintained for years. Her mother was taking classes to update her skills for the local job market, studying in the evenings after spending days taking care of Kira's younger sister and managing the household on a tighter budget than they had ever had to navigate. But they were surviving, adapting, slowly building new lives that incorporated elements of their Louisiana heritage with the realities of their current situation. Papa visited when he could, making the long drive from the bayou to spend weekends helping them settle in and continue Kira's training in the makeshift dojo they had created in their apartment. "How was school today, Cher?" Papa asked during one of his visits, his weathered hands working through the familiar ritual of inspecting her technique as they practiced together in the converted dining room. His eyes were sharp despite his age, still capable of spotting small flaws in her form or moments when her mental focus wasn't quite aligned with her physical actions. "Different," Kira said, executing a combination that flowed smoothly from defensive positioning through counterattack to control hold. "Better?" Papa nodded, understanding more from her tone and body language than her brief words conveyed directly. He had been worried about her during those first difficult months, watching her struggle with the social challenges of her new school while maintaining the discipline and moral framework he had worked so hard to instill in her. "The techniques are just tools, Cher," he said, repeating one of his fundamental lessons as he guided her through a complex series of movements designed to develop both physical skill and mental discipline. "What matters is the person using them. You've become a strong person, inside and out. That makes me proud." The approval meant more to her than any victory in the courtyard could have, validation from the person who had shaped her understanding of strength and responsibility, who had given her the tools to defend herself while teaching her the wisdom to use those tools appropriately. Papa's pride wasn't based on her fighting ability, but on her character, on the choices she had made when tested under the most challenging circumstances. As spring moved toward summer and her first year at Jefferson High School drew toward its close, Kira found herself looking forward to the future with something approaching optimism. The friendships she had begun to build, particularly with Danny, promised to continue and deepen over time. The respect she had earned from her classmates created space for her to explore interests and activities that had been closed to her when she was seen as nothing more than a target for entertainment. The literary magazine work had proven particularly rewarding, giving her an outlet for the writing skills that Mrs. Peterson had recognized and nurtured. Her essays about Louisiana and the transition to Atlanta life had been well received, appreciated for their honest exploration of displacement and adaptation, their vivid descriptions of landscape and culture, their thoughtful examination of identity and belonging. More importantly, the experience had taught her that she had something valuable to contribute to her new community, that the differences that had once marked her as a target could also be sources of strength and insight. Her perspective as someone who had experienced dramatic life changes, who had been forced to adapt and overcome, gave her writing a depth and authenticity that resonated with readers who had faced their own challenges. The summer months offered opportunities to explore Atlanta beyond the confines of high school social dynamics, to discover the cultural resources and communities that might offer ways to maintain connections to her Louisiana heritage while building new relationships with her current home. Danny had already begun planning photographic projects that would document their explorations, creating visual records of their discoveries and adventures. "I want to photograph the real Atlanta," he had told her during one of their planning sessions, his enthusiasm for the project evident in his voice and gestures. Not just the tourist attractions or the obvious places, but the neighborhoods and communities where real people live and work. Places like where you live, stories like your family's story. The project appealed to Kira's sense of justice and her writer's instinct for authentic narrative. Too often, stories about places and people focused on surface details rather than deeper truths, on stereotypes rather than complex realities. The collaboration between her writing and his photography promised to create something more honest and nuanced, more respectful of the people and communities they would document. But perhaps most importantly, the experience at Jefferson High School had taught her that she could survive and even thrive in challenging environments, that the strength Papa had helped her develop was adequate to whatever obstacles she might face in the future. The techniques he had taught her were important, but the confidence and moral framework were even more valuable. She had learned that she didn't need to be invisible to be safe, that she could occupy space in the world without apology or defensiveness. She had learned that there were people worth defending, relationships worth fighting for, principles worth upholding, even when doing so came with costs and risks. She had learned that strength without compassion was just cruelty, but that compassion without strength was often inadequate to protect what mattered most. As she prepared for her sophomore year, Kira carried with her the knowledge that she had been tested under fire and had not been found wanting. The quiet girl from Louisiana who had once pressed herself against hallway walls, hoping to disappear, had discovered that she was capable of standing up for herself and others when circumstances required it, while maintaining the moral standards and human decency that Papa had taught her to value above all else. The fight in the courtyard had been just one moment in what would be a long life filled with challenges and opportunities, but it had been a defining moment that taught her who she was and who she was capable of becoming. The lessons learned would serve her well in whatever conflicts and adventures the future might hold, providing both the skills and the wisdom necessary to navigate a world that was often unfair, but never entirely without hope for those brave enough to stand up for what was right.